There are moments when silence lasts so long that it becomes mistaken for peace. Not because nothing happened, but because too much did. For years, Juanita Bynum lived inside that kind of silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy one. The kind that presses against your chest while the world keeps applauding someone else. When Bishop T.D. Jakes finally announced he was stepping away from leadership, the public reaction came fast. Gratitude, nostalgia, speculation, praise. But Juanita didn't respond like the crowd. She didn't rush to comment or defend or condemn. At 63, she did something far more unsettling. She reflected. And in that reflection, something shifted. Not a scandal, not a revelation meant to burn everything down, but a human reckoning. Because sometimes the most dangerous truths aren't explosive, they're quiet, steady, and undeniable. Juanita understood something most people missed. Leadership doesn't end when a title changes. It ends when the body and soul can no longer carry what the system demands. And she had watched that cost up close long before anyone else was willing to name it. Long before arenas, cameras, and conference stages, Juanita Bynum's life was already marked by survival. Her story didn't begin with influence, it began with collapse. She moved through seasons most people never recover from: mental health institutions, eating disorders, deep poverty, suicidal despair. Faith didn't arrive as a brand or a business plan. It arrived as oxygen, something she clung to simply to stay alive. By the time she returned to ministry in New York, she wasn't polished or strategic. She was raw, disciplined, and desperate to make meaning out of pain. She preached in spaces that didn't promise anything except another chance to speak. No one was watching nationally. No one was building her image. And maybe that's why her voice carried such weight when it finally reached a larger room. She wasn't performing healing. She was still walking through it. That difference would eventually change everything, for better and for worse. When she stepped into the Woman, Thou Art Loosed conference, Juanita didn't arrive with expectations of elevation. She came as one woman among thousands. But something happened when she spoke. Not because the message was shocking, but because it was honest in a way the room wasn't used to hearing. She talked about intimacy, shame, desire, fragmentation, topics that were often whispered about but rarely addressed without filters. The response wasn't polite. It was visceral. Women stood, cried, recoiled, released. What she said unlocked something many had carried quietly for years. That moment didn't just introduce Juanita to a platform, it transformed her into a symbol. And symbols are powerful, but they are also dangerous. Because once someone becomes symbolic, they are no longer allowed to be complex. The platform that lifted her would also begin to define the boundaries of who she was allowed to be. As her influence grew, the rules around her tightened. Success came with expectations she never agreed to but was expected to honor. Within charismatic church culture, elevation is inseparable from hierarchy. Authority flows downward. Independence is tolerated only when it doesn't disrupt the system. Juanita's voice was celebrated, but only as long as it remained aligned. She didn't see herself as rebellious. She saw herself as truthful. But truth, when it doesn't submit neatly, makes institutions nervous. Conversations behind closed doors replaced open collaboration. Guidance felt more like correction. The more she resisted being shaped, the more distance formed. And when separation finally came, it came without ceremony. No explanation, no acknowledgement. One day she was everywhere. The next, she was gone. Silence filled the gap where clarity should have been. Losing a platform doesn't just change your visibility, it changes your safety. Juanita's life entered a season where nothing felt anchored. The marriage that followed was presented as triumph, but internally it was fragile. She was expected to model restoration while privately unraveling. When violence finally surfaced, it shattered every illusion the church preferred to maintain. She chose to speak, refusing to spiritualize abuse or hide behind language that protected institutions instead of people. That choice cost her deeply. Support was sparse. Alignment was quiet. And for the first time, the woman known for strength stood publicly as someone wounded. It was a moment that exposed a harsh truth. Vulnerability is celebrated on stages, but resisted in real time. While Juanita rebuilt from fragments, Bishop Jakes expanded. His ministry evolved into an empire: books, films, conferences, global influence. Faith became scalable, carefully managed, designed to travel well. There's nothing inherently wrong with growth, but growth changes the stakes. It demands consistency, polish, and protection. Juanita's ministry moved in the opposite direction. Smaller rooms, fewer buffers, more risk. Where one path rewarded composure, the other punished exposure. And both paths existed within the same system. One survived it. One was nearly destroyed by it. As Juanita spoke more openly about trauma, exhaustion, and emotional collapse, invitations slowed. Churches grew cautious. Transparency made people uncomfortable. Her words didn't promise victory, they asked questions about prosperity, about burnout, about what leaders are allowed to admit. In a culture that rewards certainty, her honesty felt unstable. And so the distance grew, not because she was wrong, but because she was disruptive. When Bishop Jake stepped down, Juanita didn't hear scandal. She heard fatigue. She recognized the signs because she had lived them. Her response wasn't accusation, it was context. She spoke about systems that elevate people beyond their humanity, about leadership structures that confuse endurance with calling. She didn't claim insight into his private life. She spoke from her own body, her own collapse, and in doing so, she reframed the moment, not as failure, but as consequence. Her reflections forced uncomfortable questions. What happens when success outpaces care? When branding replaces accountability? When leaders are expected to absorb endless demand without rest or repair? Juanita's life offered a sobering answer. She had been useful until she became inconvenient, honest until honesty cost too much. Her survival was not protected, but it was earned. At 63, Juanita Bynum no longer chases platforms that once defined her worth. She speaks now because she can afford to, because she has already been removed, already been broken, already rebuilt. Her story is not about blame. It's about cost. The cost of silence, the cost of control, the cost of asking human beings to perform perfection until something finally gives. Maybe this wasn't just a resignation. Maybe it was a mirror. And the question that remains isn't about one leader stepping aside, but whether the church is finally ready to listen to the people it once pushed into silence. After the world stopped seeing her, Juanita's life didn't become peaceful. It became private. And privacy, for someone who once spoke to stadiums, is not a refuge, it's a new battlefield. She spent years in rooms where no one applauded, where no one filmed, where no one expected a message. It was just her thoughts, and the quiet that forced her to face what she had been running from. She began to understand that her ministry had never been only about speaking. It was about being heard. And when the audience vanished, she realized how much of her identity had been tied to the noise. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of questions she'd avoided for decades. Who am I when I'm not performing healing? What is my value if I'm not elevating someone else? And why had I believed the church's applause was the same as God's affirmation? The hardest part wasn't the loss of platform. It was the physical weight of everything she had carried. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. For years, she had preached as if the act of speaking could keep her alive. She had believed that the more she poured out, the more she would be filled. But the truth was different. The body keeps score. There were nights when she couldn't sleep because the past replayed like a film she never wanted to see again. There were mornings when she woke up and felt like she was starting over from zero. Her spiritual language didn't disappear, but it changed. She began to talk about restoration not as a destination, but as a slow, daily practice. And she realized that healing was not a sermon. It was a lifetime of small, difficult choices. There was a day, years after the public fell silent, when Juanita stood in front of a small gathering and didn't feel the urge to be impressive. No grand gestures, no booming voice, no polished lines. Just a woman speaking honestly to a room of strangers who weren't expecting anything from her. She told them about her marriage, about the abuse, about the loneliness of being famous and still feeling invisible. She didn't speak to be validated. She spoke because she was tired of lying. The room listened, not because they were captivated by charisma, but because they recognized the truth. It was the kind of moment that doesn't make headlines, but changes lives. Because for the first time in years, Juanita wasn't trying to convince anyone she was okay. She was simply being human. What people often miss is that institutions don't just influence leaders, they shape them. The church had given Juanita a platform, but it had also given her a set of unspoken rules. Be strong, be inspiring, be consistent, be grateful. Never show weakness, never contradict the narrative, never question the system. Those rules aren't written, but they're enforced. And the enforcement isn't always cruel. Sometimes it's subtle, a lack of invitations, a cold response, a gentle suggestion that you're being too emotional. That kind of pressure doesn't break you in one blow. It wears you down slowly, like water carving stone. Juanita wasn't punished for a single action. She was punished for being too human in a world that preferred myth. In her silence, Juanita also learned something else: how the church treats women differently. Male leaders can be flawed, messy, even scandalous, and still be embraced. But women are expected to be perfect. Not just spiritually perfect, but emotionally, physically, and socially perfect. When Juanita spoke honestly about trauma, she was labeled unstable. When she expressed pain, she was labeled dramatic. When she questioned leadership culture, she was labeled rebellious. Her voice became a problem not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient. The church celebrated her when she fit the story. It abandoned her when she refused to stay in the story it wanted to write. The reality is, truth costs money. Not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet ways that add up. Without the platform, Juanita's income declined. She had to rebuild a ministry without the safety net of a big organization. Her ministry was now dependent on small donations, speaking fees, and word of mouth. Every sermon had to earn its place. Every appearance felt like an audition. And when she spoke honestly, people didn't always respond with support. Some responded with suspicion. Others responded with judgment. She was forced to live out what she had preached for years. That faith is not a guarantee of comfort. It is a commitment to truth, even when truth does not pay. The moment Juanita stopped blaming others was also the moment she began to heal. She realized she had been hurt, yes, but she had also participated in a system that demanded her silence. She had once believed that staying quiet was loyalty, but she learned that loyalty to a system that hurts people is not faith, it's complicity. She began to speak not to destroy the church, but to challenge it to become better. She wasn't asking for revenge. She was asking for accountability, for leaders to be human, for institutions to stop using people like tools, for the church to stop confusing its own image with God's glory. When she finally spoke publicly about her experience with the church culture that abandoned her, it wasn't a dramatic speech. It wasn't a viral moment. It was a quiet interview, a conversation with a small audience, a room that listened without trying to fix her. She didn't demand that people take sides. She didn't accuse. She simply told the truth of what it feels like to be used, celebrated, and then discarded. She described the loneliness of being a leader without a family, without a community, without a system that truly cared. And she said something that still resonates: "I don't want to be famous. I want to be free." That sentence was not a plea. It was a declaration. Juanita's story is not just hers. It's a mirror for the church, for all institutions that elevate people and then forget they are human. It forces us to ask, what is our relationship with leadership? Do we worship the person, or do we care for the person? Do we build systems that protect people, or systems that protect reputations? Juanita's life shows how easy it is to mistake success for health, to confuse influence with character, to treat leaders as products rather than people. And in the process, we forget the cost of the platform, the cost of the silence, the cost of the expectations. Now, at 63, Juanita Bynum stands in a place few people ever reach, not because she has rebuilt a global empire, but because she has rebuilt herself. Her voice is quieter now, but it carries something far more powerful than applause: truth that is no longer afraid. She doesn't need the stage to prove her value. She doesn't need the church's approval to validate her calling. She has survived the system that tried to shape her into a symbol, and she has emerged with a new purpose: to speak for those who were never allowed to speak. And in that, there is a kind of healing that no platform can ever offer, because she has finally learned what the system never taught her: that her worth was never defined by who held the microphone.